Yeah, sorry guys, technical difficulties before, but I'm back. Anyway, here to talk about another topic that has been trending lately is Donald Trump's executive orders. On the campaign trail, he made a lot of promises regarding his executive orders, things that he would do on his first day in office. So, as many people know, we covered it here on the channel. He was sworn in on January the 20th, 2025. And one of the first things that he did was make good on this campaign promise that he would release the classified documents concerning the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Robert Francis Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Three of the five prolific assassinations that occurred in the 1960s. The five, of course, the three of them, and Malcolm X in 1965, and Medgar Evers in 1963. So, three of the five main assassinations he's released the files of. And this is my reaction to it. This is my opinion of it. Let's just go over what we know, not from the documents, but what we know from history about these three assassinations. One, the first one occurred on November the 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, of the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK. He was shot supposedly by Lee Harvey Oswald, and then Lee Harvey Oswald, minutes later, was shot by Jack Ruby and never brought to justice. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? Lee Harvey Oswald was an he was a communist. He denounced his U.S. citizenship, moved to Russia for a while, became the Soviet Union was then, became disillusioned with Russian communism, then moved back to the United States. Prior to that, he was a Marine, and he was supposedly involved with a pro-Castro group in the United States, because he didn't become disillusioned with communism as a whole. He just became disillusioned with the way that the Soviet Union carried out communism. So many people believe, as many know, in the early 1960s, during Kennedy's administration, he was involved with the failed Bay of Pigs operation, and he tried to overthrow Castro's government in Cuba. So many people believe that that is the reason why somebody who had pro-Castro sympathies would try to assassinate the president. Other theories, there are other theories about it. There are theories that connect the Kennedy assassination to the Johnson administration. The Johnson administration was Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, was the vice president of JFK at that time, and he would, of course, with the matter of succession, he would be the next in line after Kennedy if Kennedy were assassinated. And many people, as many know, Johnson did not get along with the Kennedy family. He felt that he was being pushed aside, that he was only chosen as the vice president to carry the South. We talked about it in the Carter video. We talked about it plenty of times, that the South was majority Democratic, the South was segregationist, the South was racist, and they would not vote for a Northern liberal from Massachusetts like JFK if JFK and his brother, say RFK Sr., were on the ballot together. They needed a Southerner to balance out the ticket. This was the way it was during the Civil War. Lincoln was a Republican, but he left the Republican Party and joined another group with the Union Party with a Southern Democrat and Andrew Johnson. So it was similar to that here. It was always you always needed that Southern Democrat to balance out the ticket, and Johnson was well respected as a senator from Texas in the South, by the Southern Caucus at that time in the Congress. So they picked him, and he thought that was the only reason they picked him. They always kind of snubbed him that it was all about RFK and JFK. So many people feel like it was jealousy on his part that maybe he would have had something to do with Kennedy's assassination. There are other theories about, that the United States wanted to escalate the war in Vietnam. Kennedy actually was the first to send troops into Vietnam, but he was, to help the Democratic government, the Thien government in Vietnam, our allies there in Vietnam, against Ho Chi Minh and his uprising, Ho Chi Minh, the communist, from taking over the entire government. Was part of what they called the containment policy. They wanted to contain communism in various areas, particularly in Latin America and Asia. So many people feel that had something to do with it. Another thing that was happening, that while Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General of the United States during this time, during his brother's administration, that he was involved, in trying to take down the mafia, trying to take down organized crime, which was very strong and influential at this time in the United States, particularly in our American cities. And he was holding congressional meetings to try and, take down the mafia. So many people feel like the mafia may have had something to do with it, as well as Kennedy's, kind of owing allegiance in a sense to the mafia, because his father rose to political prominence in the 1920s, Joe Kennedy Sr., with the help of many mafia bosses, in Massachusetts, being Catholics and, being Irish and being somewhat tied to Irish organized crime out in Massachusetts, particularly in Boston. And, the mob kind of felt betrayed. And there are theories to that during the 1960 election of Kennedy and then Vice President Nixon, that the mob kind of, cheated on behalf of Kennedy, on Kennedy's behalf, by stuffing ballot boxes, to get him to win. So, they do that. Whether they do it legally or illegally, they come out, they support him because he's Catholic, because he, has those mob ties going back to the early inception of the mob, and then he comes out and he betrays them. They kind of feel like he turned his back on them, right? So, by having his brother, go after organized crime. So many people feel like they might have had something to do with it. Some of the anti-Castro people, they feel like the anti-Castro Cuban community may have had something to do with it, because they were angry that Kennedy, during the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, failed to strike against Castro and the Russians. Kennedy, there was that window where the United States had discovered that Russia had missiles, on Cuban bases ready to aim at the United States, and it could have started a world war in the early 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it didn't, because Kennedy didn't act on it. And he acted in the Bay of Pigs to try to overthrow Castro, like I said, but he failed. So that was the beginning of when the Cuban American community began to, like I always say, turn against the Democratic Party, because they feel like the Democratic Party failed them in helping them to overturn the Cuban Revolution. So Kennedy had many enemies, and there are many conspiracy theories regarding that. Many people feel that within the State Department, that they had reasons to want to murder Kennedy and pin it on Lee Harvey Oswald, who, when he was arrested, claimed that he was a patsy because he was the perfect candidate, given his background, ex-military, denounced American citizenship, moved to Russia, married a Russian wife, and then was a Castro sympathizer, a radical leftist. And given Kennedy's anti-communist stance, very harsh anti-communist stance, it would stand to reason that uh, a pro-communist would want to murder him in the atmosphere of the Cold War at that time. So they put it on him. But then minutes later, like not so long after that, Jack Ruby, a businessman in Dallas who had ties to the mob, murders Lee Harvey Oswald. So, what are they? The thing is, like, what are they trying to cover up? So these documents could reveal something. Could reveal something that Americans have always speculated about. They build a whole uh, cottage industry around the belief in JFK conspiracies. The Warren Commission was released in the 60s, and they found that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman, but that could be false, depending on what these documents say. Now, in regards to RFK, Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy Sr., uh, was also murdered. His took place in June of 1968 in the Ambassador Hotel. After his brother's death, he kind of fell into the fell into the fell out of the limelight, of politics and didn't want to really run. But the Democratic Party was in a state of disarray. The southern constituency of the Democratic Party had turned against, and that was another conspiracy theory that Southerners, particularly Southern white supremacists, had probably murdered Kennedy because he came out very publicly and very vociferously in favor of civil rights when he was campaigning in 1960, JFK. But RFK even more so, because by this time we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed by Lyndon Johnson. Johnson defying all conventionality. All the Southern caucus, like I said, back Johnson up because he was a Southern politician. They figured that he would go along to get along like all Southern politicians since the end of the Civil War and go along with their agenda. He did not. He turned against their agenda, and he voted for equal rights for African Americans. So the South is turning slowly against the Democratic Party, and the Vietnam War is escalating. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the United States government alleged that the Vietnamese communists attacked us in the Gulf of Tonkin in Southeast Asia, led to an escalation in the war in Vietnam, right? So now we're not only just helping our allies, the South Vietnamese, to defeat the Viet Cong, we're now actively engaged on a greater level, and the American people are heavily against this war. You know what I mean? There's protest. There's protest everywhere. There's protest on college campuses. People are coming out against this war. Even Martin Luther King Jr. is starting to, in the mid to late '60s, come out against the war. You begin to see the beginning of the hippie movement. White youth, for the first time ever in American history, disagreeing with the pro-United States, pro-capitalist, agenda of their parents. They're no longer America rah rah in the way they were during World War II or the Korean War that preceded it. McCarthyism, all this witch hunts of who uh, we talked about it, in the Meet the Ricardos videos of people in Hollywood that, were supposed communists, all this anti-communist witch hunts, this red baiting has kind of worn the American people down. And with the rise of the New Left, the Cuban Revolution, the Maoist Revolution in China in 1949, um, you know, they don't look at communism as the big boogeyman in the way that they once did, and a lot of Americans are embracing, alternative attitudes towards America's military and towards the Cold War in and of itself, not just the Vietnam War, but the Cold War as a whole. So you're seeing the counterculture movement come to rise, come to fruition. Um, a greater push for black equality, the black civil rights movement was just about voting and just about integration and ending. Jim Crow has now given way to the Black Power movement. The radical voices in the Black Power movement, such as Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, which was founded in 1966, have kind of overtaken the more moderate voices. Well, they weren't moderate at the time when they were saying it, but they're considered moderate now. Considered moderate by the mid to late 60s. They've kind of overtaken the more formally moderate voices of, say, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Martin Luther King Jr. You know, a push for black equality, not just legally, but socially as well, especially in urban cities, where there was a large black population, such as Oakland, where the Panthers were founded, or Chicago or New York, where the Nation of Islam was, located, and other groups, such as SNCC, black students on college campuses, for example, pushing for greater social equality for black people. And like I said, that coalescing with the anti-war movement and the hippie movement, to the counterculture movement, kids going against their parents, and the social norms at the time, the sexual revolution, drugs, Timothy Leary, encouraging people to abuse acid. So all this is happening in the rise of rock and roll music, rock and roll becoming harder and edgier than it was. Previously it was just, Elvis, Chuck Berry, and then it gave way to the British invasion of the early 60s, the Beatles, all that stuff is now giving way to acid rock. On the West Coast, Haight-Ashbury, which is basically a commune of hippies. They call them hippies, but they're young white teenagers that go against the social norms of their society. They are hip to the lies of the older people of their society. So this is happening, especially on the West Coast. So the Democrats, who were previously, the leftists, they were, advocates of the labor movement, advocates of early desegregation, they're starting to lose ground because the young people in the public are becoming further to the left than they are, and they're opposing Johnson. The chant in the street is LBJ, LBJ, how many babies did you kill today? Basically, indicating that we're out there killing babies in the Vietnam War. And in many cases, we were, because the Vietnamese fought, with guerrilla tactics. They didn't use conventional warfare tactics that we were used to, say, in fighting the Germans in World War I and World War II. They used guerrilla tactics, similar to how we use guerrilla tactics, in the Revolutionary War against the British, but they used even more guerrilla warfare tactics, hopping out of trees and using, babies as shields and shit like that. in Vietnam, which is why they won. One of the reasons why they won. The other reason I always say was because we lost we lost the support of the American people. Television is a new invention, and every week, every day, on the nightly news, we would see different footage of the gruesome, war. All wars are gruesome. The World War I was gruesome. World War II was gruesome. But TV wasn't invented then, and plus, during World War I and World War II, we came into those conflicts late. We came into World War I like at the end of World War I. We came into World War II in 1941, and the war had already been raging for 3 years since 1939. Before that, you know what I mean? So it wasn't we weren't as directly involved. Whereas Vietnam, we were directly involved, and plus television was bringing the war right into people's living rooms. We were seeing images of the war every single day on TV. They never again did this. Other wars that they had subsequently, say the Persian Gulf War, say Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, or the war in Afghanistan, we weren't seeing it on the nightly news every single day the same way. Television kind of saw that that was not a good idea, but in the 60s, they didn't know that. You know what I mean? So Americans were disenchanted with the war, and that's one of the reasons why we didn't win. So the Democrats are in a quagmire now. Johnson has dropped out of the race. Johnson is highly unpopular. He says he will not seek his party's nomination for the election in '68. So his vice president, Hubert Humphreys, is running. But of course, the more radical Dems, the new kids, the new left, they don't like Hubert Humphreys because he's associated with the sitting administration that is doing all these atrocities. So they nominate uh, somebody called Eugene McCarthy. But in addition to Eugene McCarthy, they want Robert Kennedy to run because they have this whole image of Camelot. They're still in love with the movie. They look at the Kennedys as the Shangri-La period before the Kennedy's assassination in '63 was a great period in American history. Kennedy John F. Kennedy re-energized the youth after having this old President Eisenhower, who was associated with World War II, was a hero general in World War II, kind of the older generation. Kennedy was the new generation. So they see his brother in a similar light, where they see Hubert Humphreys as representing the older generation. So it was kind of like, uh, say, 2016, right? In 2016, the Democrats wanted the Democratic voters, the Democratic constituency, the younger voters, they wanted somebody different. They didn't want somebody that was associated with Barack Obama's administration and Hillary Clinton. They wanted Bernie Sanders. But the DNC didn't want Bernie Sanders. The people wanted Bernie Sanders because he had policies that were to the left of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. But the the voters wanted Bernie Sanders. But it ended up that the voters didn't get their choice. They got the establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton. Well, that was similar here. The only difference here is that RFK might have won in 1968, were it not for him being assassinated. So he already had won two states. Um, During that time, he won. He won South Dakota and California already, but he was campaigning in California. He won California, but he was still campaigning in California, unsure that he was going to win California at that time. And there are debates with him and um, Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California, and a rising star in the Republican side, during the 1960s, because Reagan was seen as restoring law and order. Reagan makes his political debut in 1964 at the Republican National Convention for Barry Goldwater, right? So, um, Kennedy already won California and South Dakota. So he's in the Ambassador Hotel in California. He's campaigning. He didn't know he was going to win California, right? He had it in the bag. He just didn't know it yet. And he's campaigning there, and Sirhan comes up to him and shoots him. Now, who is Sirhan? We had a video here on this channel on Sirhan. Sirhan was a Palestinian man, a Palestinian Jordanian citizen, because and he was upset with Robert Kennedy Jr. because in 1947, RFK visited Israel, and there was a claim at this time, during the 40s, because Israel has socialist leanings. Many of the founders, we talked about it before, many of the founders of the state of Israel a lot of them were socialists, some were outright communists, especially during the second, at least what's going on. The, second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration of Israel, a lot of them were socialists. So there was a claim at that time, before the state was established in 48, that maybe Israel would go communist too. So maybe the Soviet Union would be their ally as opposed to the United States. That didn't happen. RFK calls that claim. There's a quote from him that says it's fantastically untrue. It's fantastically absurd. So, but fast forward, this is 1968. And what happened the year before, 1967, the Six-Day War? We know about it. We talked about it a lot on this channel. Israel defeats multiple Arab armies for the second time in a record speed, 6 days of war, captures the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. They capture it. And RFK is in support of Israel. He's a Zionist, right? He's a supporter of Zionism. He supports the Israeli occupation at that time of West Bank, Gaza Strip. West Bank is where Sirhan is from. So many people believe that was his motive to murder RFK in revenge for RFK's support of the Israelis' preemptive strike on his homeland in the year before, in 1967. But the problem is, Sirhan, the guy who was supposed to have done it, he says he doesn't remember it. He has blank in his mind. He doesn't remember it. So many people believe that he was put up to it, that he was brainwashed in a process of MK, what they call MK Ultra, right? Brainwashing techniques that the Nazis had used during World War II. Because RFK was such a contrarian candidate. So this is part of the conspiracy theory behind RFK's murder, that it was not Sirhan, and it was not motivated by RFK's support for Israel, during the Six-Day War, that it was something else more nefarious behind it. Because the United States was using a lot of these tactics during the Cold War, they had adopted. Remember, during the Cold War, they brought a lot of the exiled Nazi scientists over to the United States to adapt a lot of their tactics. So it is possible that that's what happened. Okay? So maybe the papers will say something, maybe the papers will say something about this, something about the CIA involved, with MK Ultra, mind control. We don't know. And now we get to Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. also murdered in 1968 in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassin is James Earl Ray. Now, of the three of them, James Earl Ray is the one I don't know much about, but I do know that I do know that he had pro-segregationist views. He was originally living in Los Angeles, California, but he cross-country drove to Atlanta trying to murder MLK. But again, just like um, with the other two, many people believe that there are other types of motives behind this, particularly the U.S. government, because the U.S. government, particularly the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, was targeting Martin Luther King for years, going back to the 1950s. Um, his first involvement in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. So there are other conspiracy theories with this as well. So we'll see what this we'll see what this brings. Now, I want to read some of the statements by the family. the families of the Kennedy family and the King family. Among the King's family, it says, today our family has learned that President Trump has ordered the declassification of the remaining records pertaining to the assassination of President JFK, his brother RFK, and our father, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. For us, the assassination of our father is a deeply personal loss that we have endured over the last 56 years. We hope to be provided the opportunity to review the files as a family prior to their release. That's the King family. Now, in regards to the Kennedy family, the 60-year strategy of lies and secrecy, disinformation, censorship, and defamation employed by the intel officials to obscure and suppress troubling facts about JFK's assassination has provided the playbook for a series of subsequent crises, the MLK and RFK assassinations, Vietnam War, 9/11, the Iraq War, and COVID, that have each accelerated the subversion of our exemplary democracy by the military and medical industrial complexes, pushed us further down the road towards totalitarianism. This was from RFK, and he has long called for the declassification of the murders of these three men. Now, what is my opinion? I believe that there's nothing within these that will reveal pretty much anything. Because maybe there might be something, but if there is a lot that the public does not know, because these two, especially JFK and RFK, not really MLK, people pretty much accept that, that maybe the government had something to do with it. Because the guy that they pinned it on, James Earl Ray, though he was a segregationist, though he was, radical right-wing views, he was asked by King's son Dexter if he had anything to do with it, and King's son and James Earl Ray replied no. And the fact that Sirhan doesn't remember it, he doesn't remember doing it, even though they say he had a motive for it because of Kennedy's RFK's support of Israel over the Palestinians. And the same thing with Lee Harvey Oswald. All three men, they have motives because of their political positions. One a communist, one a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, one a pro-segregationalist, anti-black racist. But that doesn't mean, a lot of people have political views, but that doesn't mean that they're the ones that killed these people. You know what I mean? They have political views contrary to the people, but that doesn't necessarily mean they killed these people, because these people have plenty of enemies. Martin Luther King was stabbed in Harlem, by a woman. They have plenty of enemies on all sides. You had the United States, the biggest one, the United States government wanting to attack all these people because Kennedy. They all had views contrary to the status quo, to the deep state, as it were, which Trump himself has had issues with, in the past. So RFK Jr. is in his administration, and he works closely with him. And these three murders, impacted the 1960s. These were three transformational figures in the culture of the 1960s. A very pivotal time in our nation. So we'll see what these things reviews, but this is huge. And I thank President Trump for releasing these documents, because this is something that Americans have always wondered about. Three people that push for civil rights, human rights, and if these three guys, Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan, and James Earl Ray did not do it, and it was the United States government. Him, we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. He was followed by the FBI for, like I said, decades and decades as being a communist because of his association with the Civil Rights March of 1963 with uh, A. Philip Randolph, who was an avowed socialist. Ralph Abernathy was also, had some. Bernard Rustin also had leanings because the Communist Party in the United States, the Communist Party of the United States, um, was very vociferous in pushing for black rights. So many black labor leaders, such as A. Philip Randolph, were associated the Pullman Porters labor movement with the communists. So the U.S. government targeted King for that, especially J. Edgar Hoover, who had his own problems. Basically, like I was saying, RFK and JFK were on the mob heavy, using the FBI, the strong arm of the FBI, to attack the mafia. But the mafia had blackmailed J. Edgar Hoover because he was a cross-dresser and stuff. And they had secrets on him, so he kind of moved his attention from the mafia to the black civil rights movement with COINTELPRO. Basically, an initiative by the United States government to undermine and infiltrate a lot of these black freedom movements that were fighting for black civil rights. The SCLC, headed by Martin Luther King Jr., the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party. Basically infiltrated them all. And SNCC as well. So they were targeting King. So it was possible, as King was starting to move in a more radical direction, moving away from just civil rights for black people and moving towards a more international scope, speaking out against the Vietnam War, speaking out against the military-industrial complex, as RFK Jr. says, America's role in the third world, colonizing and imperializing in the third world, taking the place, basically, of England. As England started to recede in the background after World War II, America took that place. The things that England used to do, the British government used to always do. Their role in espionage, their role in overthrowing regimes that were not favorable to their positions, the United States government would now do, starting from the 1950s onward. And King was speaking against that, King. And it's easy to see why Johnson's administration probably felt betrayed by that. Because here Johnson stuck his neck out and supported King's initiative for the Voting and Civil Rights Act, and now King is turning his back on the initiative of the U.S. government. And here King has these friends that have, communist leanings and were fighting communism in Vietnam. So they have provocation to attack him. That's why I said in the 1980s, when this holiday came along, many conservative senators like Jesse Helms and stuff used that to oppose him. Obviously, they're opposing him because they don't want a black man to have a holiday, right? That's their real reason, but that's not the reason that they can say, especially in the 1980s. They can no longer say that, so they have to cover it up, like Lee Atwater, the campaign manager for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, said. We can't, in the 1950s, we could say the N-word, and then by the 1960s and 70s, we can no longer say the N-word. We got to say busing or use something more obscure. So by the 1980s and 90s, you can't even use busing anymore. Now you have to use something even more obscure, like taxes or whatever. And this is the dog whistle to racists and segregationists. So that was the kind of dog whistle, that kind of red baiting. Oh, he's a communist. He was a socialist because he was associated with labor movements, right? And he criticized, capitalism and the effects that capitalism has on minority communities, particularly African Americans. So they could use that to say why he shouldn't have his own holiday. Hardcore conservatives, right? And they also use that as a reason to attack him. Now the conservatives champion MLK. They only focus on the "I Have a Dream" speech. They never focus on any of his other speeches, especially in the late '60s. They were way more radical, or during his early days. They were way more radical. When he was involved with labor movements and such. He publicly denounced communism in its in its iteration during that time of the Soviet Union, but many people did. Uh, Emma Goldman and even Lee Harvey Oswald, many people that were associated, and radical Marxists and study Marxist theory, denounce communism in its iteration in the Soviet Union, how it took form in places like the Soviet Union and China and other countries. But that didn't mean that they stopped believing in the principles of equality that it purports to embody. Peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I think this is a good thing, man. I think we need to investigate these murders because if the government had something to do with it, you know, the real people that did it should be held accountable. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you guys.